New Jersey Forest Service Pocket Presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren Seclair and I am a carbon and climate forester with the New Jersey Forest Service. With climate change constantly being a hot topic in news, on social media, and in our state, we at the New Jersey Forest Service would like to help foster your understanding of climate change as it relates to forests. We hope that by the end of this presentation, we've helped you understand current climate trends in the state, the building blocks of climate change, how the actions we take now can influence what our future climate will look like, and how we can keep our forests healthy along the way. We'll start by asking the question, what's carbon got to do with it? So what is carbon anyways, and why does it matter so much when we talk about climate and climate change? Carbon is an element and building block that makes up tons of different natural objects, including humans and trees. We're all carbon-based life forms. When we add 2 oxygen molecules to carbon, it becomes carbon dioxide. Only making up 0.04% of the air around us, carbon dioxide is essential to the process of photosynthesis, which we'll discuss in a later slide, and therefore vital to life on Earth. However, it's also a greenhouse gas that contributes to global climate change. So now that we have a base understanding of what carbon and carbon dioxide are, let's go through some definitions. As a helpful analogy, we'll pretend that water is carbon dioxide, Ziploc bags are carbon pools, and the watering can is the atmosphere. A carbon sink is a compartment within the Earth system that takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it for a specified period of time. Carbon sinks can both absorb and release carbon dioxide, but they absorb way more carbon than they release. If we think of carbon dioxide as water, we can think of a carbon sink as a Ziploc bag with a small hole in it. If you continue to pour water from the watering can into the bag faster than it's leaking out, the bag will always have water stored in it. Forests are the largest terrestrial carbon sink on Earth, which means they store a vast majority of the Earth's land carbon and why they're so important to consider when we're talking about mitigating climate change. Carbon pools are a type of carbon sink. They are reservoirs of carbon that have the capacity to both take in and release carbon. For our analogy, the carbon pool is the Ziploc bags, which are holding our water, or our carbon. A carbon source releases more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than it absorbs. Processes such as burning fossil fuels, raising cattle for food, or converting forests to developments are carbon sources. In our scenario, if carbon dioxide is water, we can think of a carbon source as a Ziploc bag with a large hole in the bottom. If the hole allows water to leak out of the bag faster than we can pour water in from the watering can, then we'll lose water much faster than we can pour it, and the bag will be empty. Carbon flux is the exchange of carbon between carbon pools. For our analogy, we could pour water from one Ziploc bag into another to demonstrate carbon flowing from one pool to another. Carbon sequestration is the uptake of carbon into pools from the atmosphere. For our analogy, think of this as pouring water from the watering can, our atmosphere, directly into the Ziploc bag, our pool. Flux and sequestration are often used interchangeably, but flux is more of the actual movement of carbon between carbon pools, so one Ziploc bag to another, and sequestration is more focused on the uptake of carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, so our watering can to our Ziploc bag. Now that we have a pretty good understanding of the terminology, let's jump right into it. Trees obtain carbon from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide, create carbon-based sugars or carbohydrates, and then release oxygen back into the atmosphere. Trees then use these sugars to grow their trunk, their branches, roots, leaves, and all of their other parts. Wood is an amazing carbon sink. About half of the dry weight of a tree is made up of carbon that was removed from the atmosphere. Trees can also release carbon back into the atmosphere through decomposition or respiration. Respiration takes the sugars created through photosynthesis and converts them into energy, or food, that keeps the plant alive, but releases some carbon dioxide in the process. The proportion of how much carbon goes towards tree growth or respiration depends on tree species, age, time of year, and environmental conditions. In New Jersey, we collect data for forest carbon from 5 different carbon pools. Remember, carbon pools are reservoirs of carbon. The U.S. Forest Service collects forest data in New Jersey, including data on tree carbon, on a 5-year cycle, and new forest data will be published in the year 2024. This pie chart tells us that not all carbon pools were created equal. Most of New Jersey's forest carbon is stored in the above-ground live plant pool, shown here in green, and the soil pool, shown here in brown. These two pools comprise approximately 78% of all stored forest carbon in the state, with the remaining 22% stored in the live below-ground pool, the litter pool, and the deadwood pool. We'll be using this pie chart along with this image to walk you through each forest carbon pool, what's included in them, and how carbon and carbon dioxide can flow through them. If we want to look more closely at carbon pools in forests, we'll start with one of the biggest. The above-ground live pool holds 39% of all forest carbon. This pool includes all above-ground vegetation, including tree and shrub trunks, branches, and leaves. Carbon mostly moves into this pool through the process of photosynthesis and can leave the pool through tree injury, death, decomposition, or respiration. The soil carbon pool is about the same size as the above-ground carbon pool and also holds 39% of all forest carbon. This pool includes all of the soil within the state's forests. Carbon mostly moves into this pool through the decomposition of plant tissues, dead wood, and litter, which all contain carbon. Carbon can remain stored in soils for millennia or be quickly released back into the atmosphere through disturbance. Things like climatic conditions, natural vegetation, soil texture, and drainage all affect the amount and length of time carbon is stored in the soil. Carbon dioxide is emitted from the soil pool through the process of respiration, as well as decomposition of soil organic matter and plant litter. The below-ground live pool holds 8% of all forest carbon in New Jersey and is mostly made up of plant roots. Similar to the above-ground pool, carbon is absorbed into leaves through the process of photosynthesis and stored throughout the tree, including the roots. It can be emitted as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through respiration of the roots or move into the soil pool due to tree death and decay. Similar to the below-ground live pool, the litter pool includes 8% of all forest carbon. Litter can include fallen leaves or needles, flowers or fruit, and seeds like pine cones and acorns. Essentially, anything small that can fall off of a tree. The litter layer doesn't actively sequester carbon, but it stores carbon that was gained through photosynthesis when it was still attached to live trees, and releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere or into the soil pool through decomposition. Dead wood makes up our smallest forest carbon pool, holding only 6% of the state's forest carbon. This pool includes all dead standing and fallen trees, logs, and dead fallen branches. Similar to the litter pool, dead wood doesn't actively sequester carbon, but stores the carbon gained from photosynthesis when the wood was still alive. Dead wood slowly releases carbon into the atmosphere over time by the process of decomposition. So based on what we know about carbon and carbon pools, we should know how much carbon is in any given type of forest in New Jersey, right? Well, that depends. Things like tree species composition, tree density, tree age, disturbances, resource availability, and climate and weather can all influence the amount of carbon that a forest can store and sequester overall. Different species of trees sequester carbon at very different rates, so groups of different trees, or forest types, will also sequester and store very different amounts of carbon. Forest age can also determine different rates of carbon sequestration. Young forests, like the one pictured here on the left, have lots of small individual trees that are able to grow quickly and sequester carbon rapidly, but don't have very large overall carbon stores. On the other hand, more mature forests, like the one pictured on the right, grow much more slowly from year to year and sequester carbon at slower rates, but store really large amounts of carbon overall within a smaller number of large individual trees. Essentially, carbon storage per acre increases with forest age, but carbon sequestration peaks when the forests are younger. Forest health also plays a huge role in carbon sequestration. If trees are spending most of their energy trying to fight off invasive insects or disease or survive through droughts, then they'll have less energy available to grow more wood, which is how they're storing their carbon. More growth equals more carbon absorption. With all that being said, the top two forest types in New Jersey that hold the most carbon are pitch pine forests and white oak, red oak hickory forests. Generally, an individual deciduous or leafy tree stores more carbon than a conifer or needle tree of the same size, because hardwood trees usually have heavier wood. But when we look at different forest types, carbon is spread across the 5 pools very differently. For example, the white oak, red oak hickory forest type has 13% more carbon stored in the above ground live pool and 19% less carbon stored in the soil pool than the pitch pine forest type, most likely due to how much denser hardwoods are than softwoods and how much quicker leaves decompose than needles. Let's remind ourselves, forests are the largest terrestrial carbon sink in the world and are equally important for sequestering and storing carbon in New Jersey. Now, when we look at tons of carbon per acre across the state, we get this figure, with the darker gray and black areas having the most tons of carbon per acre, and the lighter gray and white areas having the least tons of carbon per acre. When we highlight those areas that have the most carbon per acre in the state, we can see that they cover the highlands, the sourlands, and the pinelands of New Jersey, which are also the areas in the state that are the most densely forested. Now that we know how carbon is stored in forests and what can influence our forests to sequester and store more or less carbon, let's talk about the natural boom and bust cycle of forest carbon. Like we mentioned earlier, forests uptake carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the process of photosynthesis and store it as they continue to grow. But sometimes natural disturbances like wildfires, hurricanes, or tornadoes occur that release carbon back into the atmosphere by damaging or killing trees. After a natural disturbance with a lot of tree mortality, carbon continues to be stored in dead wood, but is slowly released back into the atmosphere as that dead wood decays. As forests die and decay, light begins to reach the forest floor and resource availability and growing space increases, allowing trees to recapture the forest and uptake and store carbon dioxide once more. It's important to recognize that tree death and forest decomposition are natural processes, and that the forest carbon cycle continues and will eventually resequester whatever carbon dioxide was emitted due to disturbances, so long as the forest remains a forest. So we've talked a bit about the carbon cycle now and mentioned some types of natural disturbances, but what else is there that can influence forest carbon? Both natural and human-caused disturbances can influence how much carbon dioxide is stored or released in a forest. Wildfire, drought, flooding, and insect damage have historically influenced carbon emissions and sequestration rates within forested systems, and forest carbon can often bounce back from natural disturbances over time. Humans, on the other hand, can cause disturbances to forest ecosystems both knowingly and unknowingly. Our presence alone on the landscape can affect forest carbon cycles in a variety of ways, most significantly by developing forests or converting them to other land uses for the long term. In the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through some specific disturbances and the ways in which they can influence forest carbon. Droughts can kill trees and forests directly by starving them of needed water, or indirectly by making trees more susceptible to damage from insects and wildfires. For example, pitch pines use resin as a defense mechanism against bark beetles, such as southern pine beetle in New Jersey. But in a drought year, they aren't able to produce as much resin and become much more susceptible to insect attacks. Natural disturbances aren't always beneficial to carbon storage and sequestration, but may have other co-benefits. For example, wildfire is natural across the landscape, and some forests are fire adapted, meaning they need low-intensity, frequent fires to regenerate and thrive. In New Jersey, the southern yellow pine group that makes up the Pinelands region includes pitch pine, shortleaf pine, Virginia pine, and loblolly pine, and these trees are well adapted to fire. They have thick bark that can withstand flames and heat, and some even have serotinous cones, meaning they can only open to release seeds in extreme heat. Historically, major wildfires would occur in New Jersey every 50 to 100 years, brought about by lightning strikes. These frequent wildfires kept forest density relatively consistent. Decades of wildfire suppression that increased forest fuels, as well as more frequent weather extremes due to climate change, like extensive droughts, have made large wildfires more frequent and more dangerous to New Jersey residents. High-intensity wildfires can directly kill trees by burning them, or indirectly by causing stress to the tree that can stunt their growth or make them more susceptible to damage-causing agents like invasive insects or diseases, both of which can cause lower carbon sequestration rates. Both native and non-native invasive insects can kill trees and stunt growth in the right conditions, and oftentimes the right conditions for insects are the wrong conditions for healthy forests. Insect outbreaks can kill trees within a few months or slowly over a few years. As trees die, their carbon transitions from the live above-ground pool to the dead and litter pools, with much of that carbon getting emitted into the atmosphere slowly as the tree decomposes. Insect outbreaks don't always kill trees, but can damage and stress them, causing them to grow more slowly and sequester less carbon in the years following an outbreak. This can lead to forests becoming carbon sources rather than carbon sinks, emitting more carbon overall versus storing it. Flooding events can occur in our forests through severe weather events that bring in large storm surges, or by things like beavers creating dams that flood the surrounding areas. Flooding events caused by storm surges can introduce salt water to our forests, many of which can only tolerate fresh water or no water at all. This results in mass tree death and carbon emissions as they decay. Similarly, when beavers create dams, surrounding forests experience sustained flooding, which can kill them. As with other disturbances, above-ground live carbon moves into the dead pool in this instance, and then is slowly released into the atmosphere through tree decomposition. You may not think deer or other herbivores eating tree seedlings or young trees would take away that much carbon, and that's true. But if there are no seedlings available to grow into mature trees because they've all been eaten or browsed, then once our overstory or canopy gets too old and begins to die off, we won't have any trees left to replace them. If we don't have a young age class of trees prepared to fill in canopy gaps or our entire overstory, then we don't have a strong continuation of carbon sequestration and potential storage. New Jersey has had an increasingly large deer population in more recent times, and this population negatively impacts successful tree regeneration across the state, eliminating many young trees that could rapidly sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Development is one of the biggest influencers to forest carbon, in that it breaks the forest carbon cycle by converting forested land to other land uses. On average, we lose about 4,500 acres of forests and forested wetlands in New Jersey each year to development. Clearing a forest for development or other land uses removes trees that are both storing and actively sequestering carbon, and prevents more trees from growing in. Development not only causes forests to lose stored carbon, but eliminates the potential for sequestration on that site for the foreseeable future. In the case of development, we're adding the emissions of forest removal plus emissions from development itself, with no way to negate that carbon cost on that site in the future. Invasive plant species can prevent the regeneration of trees by blocking out light and taking up growing space, and can kill mature trees by choking them out or by blocking out light by overtaking their canopies. Invasive plants are mostly human introduced, compete heavily with native plant species, and have very few natural predators. They tend to grow very quickly, especially compared to native species, and any management to control them must be undertaken quickly to reduce their spread. Similar to the carbon effects of browse, if we don't have an age class of trees prepared to fill in canopy gaps or our entire overstory, then we don't have a strong continuation of carbon sequestration or potential storage. Additionally, invasive plants, specifically vines, can stress mature trees, decreasing their growth rates, or can kill mature trees, slowly releasing carbon into the atmosphere as they decompose. Carbon can be stored in wood for long periods of time as a part of the deadwood pool. Common things that you have in your home or neighborhood, like wooden furniture, telephone poles, and cabinets, amongst other things, all store carbon for the life of the product, with some carbon emissions escaping as the product gets produced, manufactured, damaged, or decays. The place where your wood product originated from may have greatly impacted the forest carbon in that location. Carbon leakage refers to a situation where a company decides to move their production from a country with stringent greenhouse gas emissions policies to a country who's more lenient, leading to an increase in global greenhouse gas emissions. The USA has relatively stringent greenhouse gas emission regulations in place, and while this may seem like a good thing for our citizens, it contributes massively to global carbon emissions, which will not improve unless leakage is reduced. Using local wood products that can help to deter unsustainable forestry practices in countries with little to no emissions regulations, reduce carbon costs associated with transport, benefit local businesses and markets, encourage active forest management, and deter the movement of invasive species that tend to arrive on shipped goods. So knowing what we know now, what are New Jersey's climate goals, and why is what we do in the forest important to reaching those goals? To reiterate, carbon dioxide is a highly consequential greenhouse gas that is closely linked to climate change. New Jersey's Global Warming Response Act, or the 80 by 50 report, set a goal for reducing emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is carbon dioxide plus other greenhouse gases, to 80% below their 2006 levels by the year 2050. We can see in this graphic on the right the breakdown of greenhouse gas sources and sinks in New Jersey. The transportation sector, which is shown at the top of the graph in blue, includes the transport of both people and goods and is the biggest emitter. And we can see down at the bottom that terrestrial sinks, shown in dark green, includes forests, and sequesters approximately 9% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions in a year. This means that the state's natural features sequestered more carbon than was generated by the industrial sector in that same year, and one of our goals is to increase that 9% sequestration rate by managing our forests with carbon in mind. We hope that we've shown you that there are a lot of things that can affect carbon storage, sequestration, and emissions, and that how badly those things are affected depends on a multitude of factors. The severity of a wildfire, the local population of deer, the amount of invasive plants in an area, where we build our houses, or where we get our wood products from all influence carbon storage and sequestration in different ways. And knowing that, we have the ability to start managing those things now to maximize carbon sequestration, storage, and other co-benefits for healthy forests. Managing our forests using silviculture, which is the art and science of growing trees, and silvicultural tools allow us to remain adaptive in our management. Adaptive management is the best way to keep our forests healthy in a changing climate and on a densely packed human landscape. We can increase carbon sequestration and storage by planting new forests, reforesting areas that have been damaged by disturbances, mitigating the effects of deer browse and invasive plants on regeneration, and by keeping our forests healthy by mitigating future forest health risks. Taking immediate actions to keep our forests healthy will help our forests to be better adapted to future climate conditions. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about forest carbon and what influences it in New Jersey. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at askaforester@dep.nj.gov and stay tuned for some other pocket presentations.